Hello and welcome to Executive Sessions. I'm your host, Dr. Rod Berger. We're being joined by educational leaders from across the U.S. to break down the topics impacting our industry and communities during challenging times. I'd like to thank those who have helped bring this conversation together. I'd like to thank Strategist Group, developing and influencing through change expertise, and to our friends at EDSB, the K-12 platform of the future today. You know, this is our third installment of Executive Sessions and just an incredible guest list of leaders across the USA. I want to first welcome in Dr. Andraé Townsel. He's a superintendent of Benton Harbor Area Schools in Michigan, Dr. Kevin McGowan, Brighton Central School District in New York, and Dr. Sheldon Berman, affectionately known as Shelly in the industry, former superintendent across 28 years in Massachusetts, Oregon, and Kentucky, if I've gotten that correct, Shelly, and a recent recipient of a Lifetime Award from Castle, and his passion in SEL we will get to. I want to start with this, Kevin, if I may call you Kevin. I want to start with a conversation with one of your colleagues in Texas, Dr. Quentin Shepard, who was talking about, and through an op-ed, this power of noticing and awareness from the superintendency about the things that are going on below what we might see through the public domain in leading our districts, right? In essence, what are we noticing about things that have changed? Not just what are stopgaps or holes that we have to plug immediately, but what do we need to be noticing in the way in which we engage our communities for whatever the next looks like in our districts? How are you looking at that when you think about communicating, engaging your parents, local establishments that support the district? How are you thinking about that, and how has that changed over the last 18 months?
Well, Rod, first of all, thanks so much for having me. And Kevin's great. If I can call you Rod, you can certainly call me Kevin. You can call me just about anything you want, because I think I've probably been called it all, like my colleagues, right?
You are a superintendent then, right?
Yeah, exactly. So thrilled to be a part of this conversation. I really have focused quite a bit, and it's interesting that Quentin has brought this up too in previous conversations, on this notion of vulnerability being at the core of our communication strategies. And I was just kind of ruminating on this with a principal this morning, which I'm sure the principal enjoyed me ruminating while they had kids outside their office, as they usually do. We used to think about communication and engagement and kind of the work that we were doing and the credit we were giving as in some ways managing communication and managing interaction and kind of checking off the box that we handled a question really well, or we handled an inquiry well, and we managed that situation, we're able to move on. And I think the world has changed in a way where we need to be very vulnerable in the conversation and engage differently. Dug in with the parent, dug in with the community member, saying, well, tell me more, help me understand that. So it's not about just putting the situation off of our desk and moving on, but it's actually looking at another human being and saying, I need to understand better where you're coming from. Let's work on that together. How can we improve? How can we better serve you? It's no longer appreciated by community members and by business owners, by people that are engaging with us, that we just simply have an answer and this is the system and we move on. They're really looking for us to lock arms with them and figure out the next steps. And I think being vulnerable and being willing to say, I can learn more and I would like to know more, helps us in that. I think also, by the way, that really lends itself to a better conversation relative to equity. And the notion of tell me more is acknowledging that I don't understand. I haven't walked in your footsteps. So I would like to know more about how I can be better for you and be better with you. I think it's just a very different approach than maybe what we took before, and hopefully will lead to better discourse, more civil discourse over time.
Andre, I want to come to you. Could you speak a little bit about Benton Harbor as a community and how you think about both equity and providing platform for conversations to take place, not just to sort of put a Band-Aid on any challenge or issue the community might be having and how the school district might be a part of that, but in a way that is progressive and generative in nature, to basically welcome in the community into obviously challenges that all districts have of all shapes and sizes.
Yeah, in Benton Harbor Area Schools, first of all, we're a community in Southwest Michigan, right off of Lake Michigan. Very beautiful community, a lot of rich tradition and history. It's very important to address equity by allowing everyone to have a voice. We often engage with our community or any stakeholder of Benton Harbor Area Schools, not only in the in-person model, but also with the opportunity through social media. and opening up conversation and two-way communication through instant messaging with whatever concerns that may come down the pipe. And the goal is to respond, find the need and meet the need. In Benton Harbor, we have a great community that talks to one another and problem solve together. We look across state lines and across county lines to see the best way to give our young people equitable education, like young people across Southwest Michigan, and the Midwest region of the United States. But great community of people that just work together. I mean, I like to say this when promoting our community: is being visible, being vocal, and being vigilant. You're going to see us, you're going to hear us, and you're going to understand what it is we're trying to do. Specifically, right now, we're going through strategic planning process, and that's involving all stakeholders with input sessions, but also tapping into our alumni Facebook group that have over 2,000 members and inviting them to in-person sessions where they're actually hosting an event. So paying homage and respect to those that graduate from this phenomenal community or phenomenal high school and school district, and just keep the greatness rolling and restoring the roar and setting the bar, meeting the bar, exceeding the bar, and ultimately raising the bar.
See, there you go, Andraé. You are so good at communicating that message. I just love that. And I do appreciate the inclusion of alumni within the community. That's not something that I hear on a regular basis, but I'll speak just from personal experience. I think that can be incredibly powerful to stay engaged and to find ways to interact, even as we've all advanced in our lives, our careers, our families. Shelley, look, 28 years as superintendent, many leadership roles on a national stage. But I know that SEL is incredibly important to you, and that's your role now, obviously, with the AASA. And what I'm hearing both from Kevin and both from Andraé is sort of the beat, the sensibility, the spirit of a community. That, to me, really lends itself to this concept of maybe a social learning community, and the way in which we are packaging and putting together everything from learning to communicating with our teachers, the relationship teachers have with kids, and how that then is supported on a day-to-day basis. How do you interpret what you're hearing from your professional colleagues here?
Well, I think there are two trends that are underneath the surface, and I think that Andraé and Kevin have really highlighted them. On the one hand, as Kevin said, there's incredible vulnerability out there right now. I mean, I think with COVID, just some of the tensions that have emerged, it is really necessary to pay attention to what people are feeling and how what circumstances are influencing their lives. And as I think Andraé said, to represent this as a community, to see this as a community, and we are a community that we need to work together, to be together, to support each other, are really important themes in the way we communicate and the way we interact. The other thing that's very present is the kind of divisiveness that's hit many districts. Just locally where I am in Oregon, there were protests at school board meetings with 200 people coming about masks and vaccinations. And this is a very tense time where people are on edge, where their vulnerability is heightened, where they've taken strong positions on matters that influence schooling. And to keep coming back to that sense that we are all feeling vulnerable in this, and we all have different opinions, but we're all a community. We need to unite around our students. We need to build that sense of community. That theme is a really important theme. There's just and in fact, it's my belief that core to the work in social emotional learning for students is to build that sense of community. When you're in community, when you feel like you belong to a community, you take care of the other people in that community. There's a concept that I used to use in my teaching out of an organization called Facing History in Ourselves. It's called the universe of obligation. Who are we obligated to? And oftentimes we define that obligation as family and friends. But when you're in community and you see the necessity of being part of a community, your universe of obligation, the people you're obligated to, expands. And so you may not know everybody, but you have a sense that this is for the good of the community. And how do we make decisions that are for the good of the community? And that's, I think, what we want to communicate at a core message of social emotional learning. That's one of the things we have to communicate, that there's something about the common good. There's something about connecting with others, respecting others. And that, I think, both what Andraé said and Kevin said is really critical. Building the communication systems to reach out and have it as two-way communication rather than, as Kevin was saying, that the old way was one-way communication. Now two-way communication is absolutely critical. We have to get input, and not just through surveys.
Shelley, is that the opportunity potentially that, look, we could attack those, like you talked about, mandates and school board meetings and just sort of the tension that's bubbling up and has for many months now. But is it an opportunity now to, instead of tackling that as a superintendent or a leader of a community, as a district is, but to think about the ways in which we're communicating all the other elements of school and learning, right? So that to me feels like an opportunity to enhance those areas, so that if I'm a parent, I'm not just getting correspondence about these very sensitive, right, and divisive issues, but I'm getting correspondence on a regular basis about really kind of the most important thing to me, which is to be selfish, my kids, right? So, how they're doing in school, what they're learning about, so that I can participate and potentially put my focus and energy into that, as opposed to sort of the negative side of social media and or whatever is bubbling up at the bus stop kind of a thing. But is that the opportunity to look more intentionally at the way in which we're communicating and documenting learning, to incorporate in SEL on a regular basis, so that we don't have to keep tackling something that is probably not going to change people's minds, at least in the immediate?
Right. No, I think you're very accurate. When I was in my first school district, we did an analysis, worked with a company that did an analysis of parent satisfaction. And the primary finding of that analysis was that the more a teacher communicated about the success, the concerns around a parent's child, the more, whether it was positive or negative, the greater they felt affiliated with the school district, and the more confidence they had in us. And it came down to the teacher level. So I think, as superintendents, we're very aware of our communications and the critical nature of our communications. And what often is even more critical is that the whole district has to be in communication. It's got to be the teachers, the principals. The communication has to be not just a central function. It's got to be a core function of what we do as educators.
Kevin,
we care. That's a simple statement.
Yeah, look, we see that in business, right? If we sort of take ourselves out of education, and education to many is also a business, right? These are major operations, but in business, that's the same thing, right? Shelley, if I'm your client, right, the more that you and I have conversation, probably the better I'm going to feel about the work that I've contracted you to, right? Kevin, to that element, if that's the opportunity, and we are carving out a space to be able to do that, it seems to me that one of the elements we have to be very cognizant of is our relationship at first with data. Because data can mean something. Data can mean funding that Andraé gets at his district, or that my local district gets, or it can imply that my child needs assistance, or that, any number of things. But it feels like this is a fantastic opportunity to understand our relationship with data and how we communicate that learning, to have that sort of, it's like in marketing, that pull effect, right? We want to pull people into our ecosystem. And it feels like that communication of data and progress could be something that's a little bit different than what it used to be, even just 18 months ago. How are you thinking about that and conceptualizing that as a leader in your district?
That's a great question. You used a word earlier that I think is important for us to point out. If I was back teaching second grade again, I'd start to write these words on the board. And we talked about vulnerability and connection. And I think Andraé and Shelley really did a wonderful job of exploring those areas. I would add intentionality to that. The notion of being intentional in our communication, intentional in providing access, in listening, and being vulnerable, in being open to growing. And I think being intentional in how we're communicating, what we're communicating, and when we're doing that. So predictability to that, but starting to use data. You bring up this interesting concept of that relationship to data. We're in an environment right now where truth and facts haven't mattered as much to people, or an agreed upon set of facts and truth have not maybe mattered as much. And we need to find a way, I think, to get back to quality sets of data that people can accept and utilize in their own decision-making process. So, people now are very conversant in this percentage effectiveness of masks, this probability of getting COVID based on the Delta variant, this infection rate meaning X, Y, or Z to a particular community member. I think that it is really incumbent on leaders to use numbers very carefully, to make them a part of the conversation, but to be consistent in that. So in other words, if I'm communicating a dashboard on infections and on vaccination, stick with the same data set from the same source, be consistent in that, be predictable, so people don't have to now go and look for additional information and kind of evaluate your source over and over and over again. Don't throw this study and that study and then this study and kind of grab the hodgepodge of everything that's available to us, but be very consistent and be measured in that. And then I think being consistent in the data you're using to evaluate your progress in the areas that are most important to you, and think about the messages you're sending. So we talk about our graduation rate data, but we make sure that when we talk about it relative to all groups of students. And we talk all the time about how our graduation rate has never been higher in our district. But more important to us is that our graduation rate for all students from all groups in our district is nearly identical, and that we've resolved gaps in our graduation rate. We actually lead with that to talk about how all of our students are graduating at such a high level, and that this is an important part of our equity conversation, that it's not just success for our students, but for all of our students. We talk about then our participation in AP coursework and why that's important. So tell people why you're using a particular measure and what you're deriving from that, and that our increase in the students from underrepresented populations tells us that we are providing access to rigorous coursework for all students. So in other words, every piece of data then ties back to all students, all students, all students. That consistent messaging, I think, helps people be very comfortable then in data and get the meaning that you're trying to convey in that.
Is there a loose, maybe silver lining to what we've gone through in the last 18 months, in that we have, as a citizenry, become more comfortable, if I can say that, in the discussion of data, right? To sort of take opinions and positions out of it, but just the conversation. Has that sort of reduced stigma so that teachers can have more ongoing casual conversations about data in their classrooms, and that it's not something that we're just talking about like in the business world on a quarterly basis, or when we have to set a meeting to talk about data, that we're now a little bit more comfortable with it? I think people can associate fear to money and numbers in the same kind of a way, that as you get comfortable, you're more willing to look at it, personal budgets, family budgets, the businesses that you run. Could we see that in the way in which we understand, interpret the data sets that are presented based on the learning we're seeing in the classroom? And that impact the questions that we then ask of our curriculum and the impact on teaching and learning?
I think that's a really interesting perspective, because it was not too long ago when people would complain about having their child reduced to a number and be concerned about the notion that we're evaluating the progress in schools based on a particular set of tests and one measure, et cetera. And we did a lot of talking about how, no, we're not doing that. We look at all multiple measures, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm seeing less and less of that conversation, I think probably because we are using numbers now so much actually to talk about individuals and populations. Outside of just the education sphere, it's in the public health sphere very much, or economic data that's constantly in the news media. I think people are much more comfortable, and now it is a safer set of data. Actually, it's not about those things they think are politically impacted, but rather it's about their individual child. And because they're comfortable talking about numbers, they're really seeing more meaning in that and understanding the comparison of their child to a larger population or to progress over time and where kids should be. It probably is really creating an environment where teachers are able to more effectively explain where a child is and understand the success with the curriculum they're using based on a number. That's a really interesting proposition.
Andre, let's talk about parents in your community. If we're talking about data, do you find that parents with better information, more information, ask more thoughtful questions tied to the teaching and learning of their child? And how is that played out in Benton Harbor?
Yeah, well, I'll say, I think it was Jay-Z who said, men lie, women lie, numbers don't. And that's just how it goes. The numbers are what they are, you know. I think, let me start by saying this, and this is just to co-sign social emotional learning. What I've learned in my leadership is as climate and culture goes, so goes curriculum and instruction. By having great relationships with not only teachers and administrators, but families, you can get a lot of good work done for kids organically just by having those appropriate relationships. And then here in our community, man, we have a phenomenal relationship with our families to where we always have tough conversations. And out of those tough conversations come solutions. Now, everything that we do here in Benton Harbor Area School, everything, even if it comes with a dollar amount or not, even if the emotional energy that you put into, we always look at something called the AROI, even in conversations with parents, and that's the academic return on investment. Us talking about this shall give us what outcomes. Us investing in this program shall give us what outcomes. And those outcomes are to be aligned with the strategic plan or aligned with the goals of the school improvement plan, district improvement plan. Whatever it is, it's not just wasting time venting at forums. And no, it's the bottom line, and that's increasing academic achievement over time. Whether it's a proficient or advanced increase in mathematics, science, English, whatever the case, graduation rates, the goal is to increase academic achievement through an academic return on investment and ensuring that climate and culture is first and foremost so you can do the hardcore work of teaching and learning for our kids. So, you know, our parents are completely locked in with that philosophy as we move forward together as a school community.
Andre, if I'm a new family coming into your district, how is the district, from a teaching and learning perspective, how has it changed from, let's say, 18 months ago to today? And what would I be able to expect in those changes relative to hybrid learning, remote technology? Because if not all, most districts have had to make significant pivots that were not temporary. They are now with some level of permanency. And I think that is now something that districts are communicating to new families. What would I expect to experience in Benton Harbor?
I think what has changed is the guarantee of more options. Even when you're considering potentially looking at a multi-tiered system of support. So for example, at our secondary level, the first tier for secondary education is traditional high school. That intense student learning level, that targeted support learning, we have an alternative school where young people can still, have personalized learning, but not in a traditional setting. And then ultimately, we have a very intense secondary program through our Graduation Alliance. So 3 levels of ways to complete your high school diploma in Benton Harbor Area Schools. Additionally, looking at, for example, staying on the climate and culture piece, in the event where you potentially in the past will probably suspend long-term or expel some young people completely from your district. Now having these virtual options, you have another type of in-school suspension where you still take ownership of your student, you're still responsible for their education, but it's an alternative way of discipline where our young people are not missing that academic requirement for them to be successful in our society. So in Benton Harbor Area Schools, options are a lot more available. That's what's different. We now have multiple opportunities to ensure our young people are being educated. Even when you're looking at snow days, now I don't want to get away from snow days, but you can almost argue that snow days are now obsolete potentially with the fact of virtual learning and virtual school or remote learning where young people can potentially learn from home while teachers potentially teach from home. Now, we have not decided to go down that route, but that is still an opportunity with how the landscape of education is changing in general.
Yeah, time is money and valuable, right? Especially when we're thinking about the construction of our school calendars and school days. Kevin, let's talk about, I'll use a term that sounds very negative in this regard, but failure or fear of failure at the district level. What are challenges that maybe the public they're not aware of, right? They might come close, and if they dive in a little bit and they have some general interest, maybe they have an understanding of ESSER funds and some of the relief efforts out there to support, from a financial perspective, districts in sort of catch up in a multitude of ways. What are some current challenges that maybe not even just your district, but you're hearing from your colleagues in that shared sort of relationship with other superintendents around the country that I think would be impactful for the audience to know about? What are we missing outside of ESSER funding, or things that we really need to be paying attention to?
Well, I mean, do you mean fear of failure, discussing the fear of failure, that the reasons why it might hold people back, superintendents back from making certain change?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, I've heard off the record superintendents sort of bemoan, fellow colleagues around the country and the way in which they are allocating ESSER funds. And that, look, this is potentially an opportunity to spend differently for the new world that we inhabit. And so can we be more progressive? Can we think about doing things in a different way? Do we have to be what people assume education is and will always be, which is sort of slow moving, not progressive, like the world that we live in as adults? And so that potentially that fear of failure or in changing an institution writ large.
Yeah, so I've become very comfortable lately in quoting my new favorite person, fictional person at least, in Ted Lasso, who said, change is like riding a horse. If it's comfortable, you're probably not doing it right. I think that it's beyond just uncomfortableness. One of the challenges that I think should be recognized is that in leading organizations during a very divisive, tenuous, difficult period of time, you're asking lots of people to take risks to follow you, right? Emotionally, you're taking a risk. You're taking a risk maybe in terms of your job. You're taking a risk in terms of just doing something differently that could be very uncomfortable. And that's hard for people to do under the best of circumstances. But in an uncertain time with a lot of challenges for people outside of work and outside of their kids' school notion, school's been a safe place. And now we're talking about big change is risky for people. There's also the risk politically. So, we work for across the country in a lot of different arrangements, but school boards who have all different challenges and opportunities and, themselves different political backgrounds and dynamics that we face during a time that's very politically divisive. So there are people that are calculating their ability to be progressive and to be different also based on just being able to do the job by being able to stay in the job and live to see another day. When Shelley mentioned protests outside of meetings and, challenges over masking and the incredible things that are happening around us, and we would really like to say, look, there's a new resource in funding. We could really leverage that to think differently. This is a once in a generation opportunity, actually, to leverage funding, which we've always said we needed. And now we could use that to do things differently. How do you do that when there's this incredible risk for you personally as a leader to be able to continue to do the work? There's risk for board members politically. There's risk for the people that follow you in terms of your leadership team, but your teaching staff, all of your staff members, community members, et cetera. It's hard to do it. But it's maybe also never been more important. I guess I would probably say to people, so there's these challenges, there's these economic challenges, these political challenges. It's probably about finding the right balance between supporting what works in schools, what we know works and what is comfortable for people, but also really having an open and honest conversation with the community about the opportunity to innovate, to think differently, to do the types of things that Andraé has talked about in terms of multiple pathways for his kids to graduate. And just explain that to people. Get right out there and be very open and upfront about this incredible opportunity that people can provide, like Andraé's doing.
I'm going to put my parent hat on, Kevin, and start this question based on sort of what I experienced and other parents in conversation during the pandemic and remote learning and hybrid learning opportunities and or challenges. Let's pivot on and think about the providers out there that support districts. Because if we think about SEL, I mean, it really is a network of support and relationships. And one element of that, it goes to the technology community, the curriculum community, those that are supplying what our children are interfacing with on a day-to-day basis, right? How have those relationships, in your estimation, changed as a result? Because there was so many districts and stories about, just purchasing all kinds of things and looking at usage rates that were just anemic because a lot of teachers didn't even know that they existed, right? But yet we could say on the public facing front, oh, we have all of these great resources, but they weren't being applied in the classroom. I'm getting a sense that we're becoming more discerning as a consumer base from the education side. And I'm hoping that then results in better questions, requests of our vendors and providers of technology and curriculum. How are you seeing that? And is that a focus and a discussion point with and amongst your leadership team?
Yes, I think that you make a great point about anemic usage rates. So we've, often over the past year and a half, reflected on the fact that we made 7, 8, 9, 10 years of progress in terms of implementation in a very short period of time. And although we would never wish the pandemic on anybody, and it's not a way to make change, and nothing is positive about that. However, a silver lining, to use an expression used before, would be that we were able to work on implementation that was taking much longer and out of necessity had to happen much faster. To the business community in that conversation, I like to think of the relationship as solution providers. I know many of our partners talk about those things, or using the word partnerships, and developing much better back and forth with particular solution providers on how their product can adapt, can better interface for parents, work better for staff. The people that we find are the best to work with are those that are constantly taking feedback and working with us on how can we improve our product. I've had conversations with two partners very recently, Thought Exchange, a solution provider on communication, and SuperVal, a platform for evaluating performance, both superintendents for administrators. And they've made immediate product changes based on feedback that, this doesn't make a lot of sense. When people go and log in this way, or when they do this and they have to take this step, it's not working really well for them. And we're seeing that across the gamut of providers, that those who can look at you and say, tell us how to be better, and then make that change very quickly and make it make more sense for staff members, for teachers, for educators, for parents, and for community members, are most successful. And they are the ones that we want to work with more and more. So that's really part of the key here for leaders, is finding the right solution providers that can be facile and can work with you as partners. And then for those partners to realize the more they can be adaptable and facile and more customer service focused, the more successful I think they will be, and ultimately then kids will be.
Shelley, I want to tap into your experience of 28 years in the position of superintendent, and I'd love to get your advice for current superintendents, right? Those that have been in their post, like Kevin, since 2009 in Brighton, or Andraé, who is a relatively new superintendent in this space, but one that I think will be in for quite some time. What advice do you have for superintendents in the position when it comes to change, right? I love the Ted Lasso, right? I think so many people are fans of that show and the sort of the humanness behind the topic area and the way it's presented. But what advice do you have for superintendents in dealing with and understanding change and how that change is then exhibited? Because I think that's part of that fear of failure discussion, Kevin, you and I were having, is that, as parents, I don't think we expect our districts to be perfect, right? We would like them to be as if we see our kids learning, which is learn about the process and how you experienced your own self within that subject over time, because it's not about getting the right answer. Ultimately, it's, did you understand how to actually navigate that? Right. So how do you think about that in the position of superintendent, and what advice do you have for your fellow colleagues?
That's a big question.
Well, I knew you could handle it, Shelley.
What I would say, that it all comes down to relationships. That the relationships you establish both with your board, your community, your staff. I think Andre's point about culture is absolutely critical. That you have to create a responsive culture in your district, and that is the core task of the superintendency. I would say that the major impact of the COVID crisis, the major positive impact of the COVID crisis on teaching, is that teachers had to work together as teams. They had to collaborate. And that kind of collaboration, when no one knew what they were doing, when you went to a remote or hybrid situation, everybody sort of pulled together. And I know in Andover, where I was, we organized teams very clearly at a school level. So each grade level, for example, the elementary school, they co-planned. It was impossible to do the work virtually without having a team around you that shared the work. And the same was true at even a high school level in subject areas. People really needed to collaborate and share because it was an overwhelming task to transform your teaching. And they built strong relationships and a strong culture out of that. I think that as we emerge from this, retaining that sense of team, retaining that sense of culture, right now, for example, some districts are really working on what I would say is labeled adult SEL. How do we support the social emotional well-being of our staff? This is still not an easy time for teachers. I mean, in many districts, they're quarantining large groups of students, or parents are keeping large groups of students home because of the concerns around masking or vaccination. Teachers are facing partial classes and then wondering, how do I make up for the time that the students who are not here have lost? How do I accelerate from the students who, accelerate learning for the students who have been left behind out of this crisis? So this is, and the only way we're going to achieve effective results is as a team, and by looking at that culture. So I would say, my advice is actually very simple. Just think about relationships and how to strengthen those relationships within and outside the school environment. And and the same is true for students. How do we help them strengthen relationships with each other so that they feel known, they feel accepted, they feel they belong? Not just because the teacher makes them feel that they belong, but because other students have been inclusive in their attitude. So that's, I think, a prime task. It's oftentimes, I just want to say this, oftentimes SEL is thought of as a add-on curriculum in conflict resolution skills or social skills. And that's not what SEL is. Social emotional learning is about the culture you create, the sense of community you create in your classroom and your school that enables students to feel that they belong and can be most effective. And so it is a little bit about teaching those social skills in that context, but it's all about relationships, and that we need to think about the health and well-being of our relationships. And I'll go back to Kevin's first point about vulnerability. We have to see that everybody feels vulnerable.
I'm going to close, Andraé, and put a bow on this conversation with you. One thing we haven't talked about, but I'd love your perspective on, is student voice and the role and the desired role that they would like to play when it comes to engaging in their own learning. Because it seems like we have such thoughtful people like yourself, Shelley and Kevin, and other leaders around the country that are being, I think, very mindful and inclusive of all the elements of a community that is needed to help support the growth and development of a child and the adults that are in their lives. But it feels like there's never been a time in history where students are accepting and open to active participation in their learning. That was not a part of what I was growing up with. I just showed up with a report card and that was kind of it. And yet we now have technology, we have platforms, we have solutions, we have all kinds of leaders like yourself where it becomes commonplace for a kid to know that there are a lot of support systems in place. Talk to me just a little bit about the students in Benton Harbor and their willingness to have exceptional leaders like yourself and the teachers that are a part of their communities support their learning on an ongoing basis.
Well, I think what's awesome about our students here in Benton Harbor is that, no disrespect to anybody, I think we have some of the smartest kids on the planet right here in my district. But listen, they're engaged and they're tapped in. They really, you have to meet them where they are, and where they are, they're on TikTok, they're on Instagram, they're on Snapchat, they're on Twitter, and they're talking. And it's important to listen to them and hear them and be relatable to them so you can have the best information possible to make their education experience as meaningful as possible. Here in Benton Harbor Area School, we're appointing students to our Board of Education to serve as a non-voting member, but a member of the board where they can, on a monthly basis, have student voice a part of our announcements and a part of our discussion, and to keep students at the center of the focus. In educational leadership, and you're dealing with all aspects of the superintendent, you're dealing with all aspects of the education system. And you can easily be blinded by what the main thing is. And the main thing is educating our kids. So keeping that voice at the table, being in tune to them, following their public social media platforms and listening and adapting and making the whatever the education curriculum is, make it so that it activates the schema of our young people to want to be engaged. One thing that we're doing here in Benton Harbor Area Schools, another way to engage our kids is really looking, and we know our kids are on their social media devices. We know they're playing video games on their PlayStation, their PCs. How do we invite esports into our schools? So we just recently, I made a pitch to a couple of different philanthropists and ultimately received a $25,000 donation to build a state-of-the-art esports team here in Southwest Michigan, so our young people can compete in a multi-billion-dollar industry to go off and get scholarships to play for esports at the collegiate level. It's treated just as academic athletics when you're playing football or basketball. Esports is the exact same thing, but you're competing and strategizing over gaming concepts. And that's just another way. So when I focus on kids and talk to kids and utilize that kid voice, all I think about is the best way to increase and enhance the 3 A's. That's academics, athletics, and arts.
Well, that's a great way to put a close to our discussion here. And you used a word there, Andraé, relatable. And that's the experience that I've had in this conversation today, which I think hopefully is doing there's a secondary benefit to these conversations with leaders like yourself, Kevin, Shelley, and others that we've been talking with, which is to say, personalizing the human behind the superintendency, the chair of the superintendency, because you're all incredible leaders that we have to get to know and engage with. And I think that will be very empowering to attracting talent at the teacher level and supporting those initiatives that we want to move through our districts to improve our communities. I want to thank Dr. Andraé Townsel, Superintendent of Benton Harbor Area Schools, Dr. Kevin McGowan, Brighton Central School District in the Rochester, New York area, and Dr. Sheldon Berman, affectionately known as Shelley, now with AASA, and bringing his leadership to districts across the country. We want to thank those that helped bring this conversation to bear. We want to thank Strategist Group for developing and influencing through change expertise, and to our friends at EDSB, the K-12 platform of the future today. I'm your host, Dr. Rod Berger.